If it's Thursday, special counsel Jack Smith signals criminal charges against Donald Trump could be imminent, warning the former president's legal team that he is officially a target of their investigation. Plus, a supreme surprise on voting rights as the conservative-leaning high court strikes down a Republican-drawn congressional map in Alabama for discriminating against black voters. And fire in the sky, the toxic wildfire haze wreaks havoc across the Northeast and beyond on the continent, forcing the White House to cancel an event tonight. A baseball game was canceled in D.C. today, and millions of people are warned to stay inside because of dangerous air quality. Hello there. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd reporting from New York. At this hour, the political world is on indictment watch, and amid mounting evidence that the special counsel, Jack Smith, and his investigation into the former president, both on January 6th in the documents, could be coming to a head, at least in one of the cases, if not both. Two sources have confirmed to NBC News that Justice Department prosecutors did tell Mr. Trump's attorneys that he is a target of the special counsel's criminal investigation, specifically right now into the mishandling of classified documents. That may be the clearest sign yet that prosecutors are wrapping up that investigation ahead of a potential indictment. Of course, a DOJ spokesperson declined to comment on the reporting. Mr. Trump, who has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing, is escalating his attack on the credibility of the investigation after being officially told he was a target. He took to social media to accuse an unnamed Justice Department official of bribery, citing no evidence. Meanwhile, we've been keeping a close eye on the action in both Miami and Washington. Both have active grand juries for Jack Smith. And we now know the special counsel has had to deploy two grand juries as part of his investigation. It appears one is focused on January 6th and one is focused on the documents. Today, David Harbach, one of the special counsel Jack Smith prosecutors, was spotted at a federal courthouse in Miami. And that's where that grand jury has been meeting. And special counsel Smith's motorcade was also seen this morning at his office in Washington, where NBC confirms a grand jury hearing evidence from his investigation into January 6 also met today. We don't know what the nature of today's session was about. We also have new developments in the special counsel's investigation into January 6, as two sources tell NBC News that former Trump White House official Steve Bannon has been subpoenaed for documents and testimony. As the former president prepares for potential criminal charges, his rivals and allies, from the Capitol to the campaign trail, are bracing for what comes next and the potential political fallout. None of us know just what the fallout would be from a federal indictment. We will dive into their reaction, what it could mean for 2024 in a moment. But we're going to begin with the very latest legal developments. So joining me now from Miami is our Justice and Intelligence correspondent, Ken Delanian. Vaughn Hilliard is outside the former president's golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey. And also with me is criminal defense attorney and NBC legal analyst Danny Savalos. Ken, let me start with you down there in Miami. Is it safe to say now the Miami grand jury is the Mar-a-Lago documents grand jury?
That's sure what it looks like, Chuck, and we have a variety of data points pointing in that direction. One, you had David Harbach, a senior figure in the special counsel investigation who normally works in D.C., walk into court this morning after we learned that Donald Trump has been told that he is a target of this investigation, and his lawyers came in what looked like a final meeting for the Justice Department. Yet, we've seen no evidence that the grand jury in Washington, D.C., that we know has been hearing evidence in this case, we've seen no evidence that that grand jury has met in weeks. Now, that's different from the January 6th grand jury, by the way, in Washington. There's two, right? So that one appears to have gone dormant, and now we're sort of learning. I'm doing some reporting, talking to legal experts about what the reasons behind that may be, and it has to do with some very technical legal issues around venue. But the bottom line is most of the conduct in this case happened here in South Florida, and as much as Jack Smith would have liked to have tried this case before a D.C. grand jury full of Democrats, it appears that they've concluded they have to bring it down here in South Florida. So this is where we are expecting any indictment to be returned.
Ken, normal grand juries hear multiple cases, make indictments all over the place. Why couldn't one grand jury handle both?
No, you're absolutely right. That's true. But we saw in the Mueller case, sometimes investigations are so complex that they demand their own grand jury. There's just so many witnesses. There have been potentially hundreds of witnesses in this case, in the documents case alone, 22 Secret Service agents alone. So a lot of testimony, complexity. And so that can take up the time of a grand jury. You're right. The normal grand juries hear dozens of cases, murders,
right.
robberies, but often in a complex case, you get one that stands alone.
Do we know how long this current Miami grand jury's been impaneled? Is it possible it's been impaneled longer than we've known about it?
Well, that's a great question. There's been some reporting that it really started to tick up in the last month or so, right around the time that the D.C. grand jury went dormant. So reading between the lines, and I'm talking to legal experts, former Justice Department officials, what they believe happened is that appellate lawyers at the DOJ, maybe the Solicitor General, weighed in and said, look, Mr. Smith, I know you would like to bring this case in Washington, but for these legal reasons, for venue reasons, you really have to come down to South Florida, and that's when they started moving the show down here. And we all missed it, essentially, until this past week.
Right. Ken Delanian down in Miami, one of the more iconic courthouses, actually, in a skyline you could be at. Ken, thank you. Let me move up to Bedminster, which isn't very far from where I am right now. Mr. Hilliard, what do we believe Donald Trump's been told by his lawyers about the meeting?
We know that they have been told at this point here that they're a target of the investigation. The extent to which the lawyers themselves even are aware of how far along this case is, though, in this investigation is still unclear. Donald Trump is here in Bedminster, where he will spend these summer months. He is no longer residing at Mar-a-Lago. When the club down there shuts down, he makes his way here to New Jersey. That is why he is here. We know, though, that Donald Trump, in social media posts over the course of the last hours, has been firing away. One early this afternoon made the allegation that there was one of the prosecutors in the special counsel's office supposedly tried to bribe a lawyer who is representing one of the witnesses in the case with the judgeship. To be very clear, there is no evidence that we have been made aware of. There were no specific details provided by the former president, yet he is using that to make the case of prosecutorial misconduct, and that the entirety of the investigation, and if an indictment were to be brought, should be thrown out. This is Donald Trump's playbook. We have seen it in the past. We are seeing it now again, where he wants just the entire process to go away because of this idea of prosecutorial misconduct.
Obviously, one of the reasons why justice will inform somebody that they're a target is also invites them to go before the grand jury if they'd like. I assume we should not expect the former president to take up that offer.
We've seen that offer made to him in the Mueller probe. It was made to him on the January 6th Select Committee on Capitol Hill. We saw it in the Manhattan District Attorney's hush money payment case, that offer made. Donald Trump has never agreed to testify under oath. There's little reason to believe that he would do that now. They've told us that he is in Bedminster here today as well as tomorrow before two political events in Georgia and North Carolina on Saturday. So there's little reason to believe that he will take part in this. We know, though, that still, including Taylor Budowich yesterday, going before the grand jury for about an hour. These are individuals who were key aides post-presidency to him. And I was, talking to a source familiar who suggested that while they believe that maybe they are getting to the point of checking some final boxes, there are still outstanding questions in Trump world of how many witnesses have they not talked to that they still want to bring back in.
Vaughn, you're a keen observer of who's in and around him in this moment. Do you get a sense that he's bringing in some allies to rally with them, that he's bringing in people to stew with, that he's, trying to establish a bulwark of allies in this moment?
I know that Marjorie Taylor Greene, for one, is going to be flying on Saturday with him when he goes and speaks before the Georgia GOP convention on Saturday. But, the support system around him for so long was largely Republican elected officials around the country. And you saw that last year when the search warrant execution in August took place at Mar-a-Lago. You saw the likes of Rick Scott, Marco Rubio, folks stand up and defend him because, he was Donald Trump. But you've increasingly heard more muted responses in the Manhattan District Attorney's case. But also now the question here is just how much of a robust defense system will he have around him? Or is it really going to be him and his phone on social media firing away, and the extent to which his own loyalists can help him in this case?
Vaughn Hilliard at Bedminster, or outside of Bedminster for us. Vaughn, thank you. Let me bring in Danny Ceballos. All right, Danny, on the defense side, you know this stuff targeting really well. How often, what's the timeline from being told you had a client was a target to the indictment itself most of the time? What's the average length of waiting period there?
First, the significance of being identified as a target cannot be understated. Generally, there are three categories. As a defense attorney, when your client is part of an investigation, mentioned, his name uttered in an investigation, you want to find out where he fits. Is he a target? Is he a subject? Or is he a witness? And I have to tell you, Chuck, even when you are at the lowest level of culpability, a witness, you are terrified. Right. And in fact, there are many reasons to even not want your client to testify when they are merely considered a witness. Because as you can imagine, a witness can turn into a target in about 5 seconds if they say the wrong thing at a grand jury proceeding. But once you are in target land, you simply cannot cooperate. So the idea, and I've heard this reported, that Trump may have been offered the opportunity to come speak. Now that he's a target, that will never, ever happen.
You would never advise a client to do that, would you?
I barely would advise a client to do it if they're merely a witness. If you're a target, I got to tell you, Chuck, for months, maybe years now, I've had a personal embargo against saying things like, any day now, or the walls are closing in. And the reason for that is I started saying it back during the Mueller investigation, and it keeps your adrenaline at a certain level that you just can't maintain. So I realized, look, it's going to happen, if at all, when it's going to happen. But this any day now stuff, it just wasn't happening the next day or the next week. Now that we're in target land, the calculus changes, for me at least.
All right,
I now believe that they're imminent.
I understand that. We're in target land, and we have an active grand jury.
Sure.
So is that, do you assume at this point the grand jury is there to hear the indictments, not to hear any more testimony?
Just because there's an active grand jury, there could be other potential targets other than Donald Trump. I held out that possibility for many months now. I mean, we had grand juries in other federal investigations that involved Donald Trump. Remember with the Mueller investigation, other people got indicted. It was always breaking news when this person or that person would be indicted. And yet, at the end of it, Trump was not. So there is that possibility.
Mark Meadows, I was just going to say, well, let's move over to the documents case, because we know Mark Meadows, I think, has had to do both.
Yes.
Given that he was the final chief of staff, it's possible that he also has criminal exposure here with the classified documents, correct?
That's possible, yes. The fact that he's testifying makes me wonder because, you know, as an attorney...
Sounds like you got advice from a lawyer to say, well, if you testify, you won't be a target.
Yeah, but see, that is the catch-22, and that's why, because grand juries are so secretive. And let me tell you something. If you haven't picked up the phone and called a U.S. attorney to try to get information about an investigation against your client, that's not a fun phone call, because they know how to have a phone call without imparting any information. Yep. They're mostly collecting, which, by the way, Chuck, in light of the reports that Trump's defense team met with government lawyers of Jack Smith's team, well, of course Jack Smith's team wants to do that. Why not get new information, hear what the defense has to say? You might get something juicy. So listen, I've never heard of those meetings changing the mind of prosecutors when the defense comes in and maybe makes an argument why their client shouldn't be charged. That's not to say that if you have the opportunity as a defense attorney, you shouldn't take it. Anything you can do for your client, but low success rate. By the way, everything in federal prosecution for the defense is a low success rate.
Look, we're all tea leaf reading here, and you're more familiar with the legal world. It does seem as if when I saw Fannie Willis, who's the Fulton County prosecutor, she laid out a timeline of potential, we know when the courthouse might need security, and she seemed to move it to closer to the end of the summer.
Yes.
That doesn't seem like a decision that's made in isolation. The likelihood that she and either Merrick Garland are at least coordinating timing. Maybe they don't coordinate, maybe they're not sharing testimony yet, although I guess that certainly is not a no-no. Is it possible, do you think, that they're communicating on timing?
Yes, and I believe it's possible that Fannie Willis is being mindful of what she understands from the federal government to be their timeline. But make no mistake about it, if the federal government feels like scrapping their timeline, whether or not that affects Fannie Willis's request to shut down a courthouse, they won't care one iota. I think in that cooperation, it's really more of a one-way street. Fannie Willis is more subservient to the federal government.
Bottom line, as you know, every assignment desk editor in America has their hair on fire, wondering, is tonight the night? Is tomorrow the day? And are people overreacting, or are we in that window?
See, Chuck, you're going to make me say it again. I have a personal embargo. Are we in the window? I just said I won't say it, but here I will. Now that he's a target,
you seem to be wanting to say it.
I want to say it, but I have made a private oath, Chuck. But I do think, in light of the target information, Here we go. The end is nigh, probably. It's going to be happening soon. I did it. You got me to do it, Chuck.
85 years over 6 million is a short amount of time, too, right?
Yeah.
So anyway. Danny Savalas, thank you. Coming up, we're going to have more on the political implication of the former president's looming legal issues ahead. But first, we're going to dive into the breaking news of the Supreme Court upholding, surprising a lot of people, a key part of the Voting Rights Act, striking down Alabama's congressional map, and potentially flipping control of the House of Representatives in the process. Not exaggerating here. I'm going to explain after the break. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. There was a big decision out of the Supreme Court today. The Supreme Court struck down the Republican-drawn congressional map in the state of Alabama. It was a map that civil rights advocates had argued discriminated against the state's black residents. Ruling upheld a key part of the Voting Rights Act. It was something of a surprise ruling from this Supreme Court that has signaled skepticism about the Voting Rights Act in the past, especially because it was Chief Justice John Roberts who wrote the majority opinion, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh breaking with their conservative colleagues to join that majority opinion. Now, Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, said a lower court had correctly concluded that the congressional map violated the voting rights law because it diluted black voters into white majority districts. Practically, the ruling means that the Alabama congressional map will need to be redrawn to likely create a second majority black congressional district. Politically and legally, it opens the door for challenges to congressional maps in other Republican-led states, including Louisiana and Georgia, and it could leave that door open for Democratic gains in those states in 2024. I'd throw in Florida there, too, that also essentially got rid of a majority African-American district in the northern part of the state that likely now will see a challenge. I'm joined now by NBC News' senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. I also have Marina Jenkins, executive director of the National Democratic Registering Committee. That's one of the organizations that supported the plaintiffs in this case. And then I have the Cook Political Report's House editor, Dave Wasserman, who can put some of these decisions into a political context. But Laura, let me start with you. John Roberts arguably has been the biggest advocate for gutting the Voting Rights Act than any other justice. And to see this majority opinion in a politically charged case like this, I'm going to take a step back, and conspiracist in me says, boy, this is John Roberts desperately wanting to show this court is not predictable.
At a time when their sort of integrity as a body, as an institution, is in question. I understand that argument. Let me give you the counter argument.
Well, please do it on the merits.
That on the law itself, this decision is sort of clear-cut. They're simply following what has already been on the books for decades.
Even though this is something John Roberts himself said he was against. That's what's so odd about this. He seems to be following a law that he doesn't agree with.
Correct. But at least the
law... Which is the job of the Supreme Court.
Which is the job, at least on paper. And I understand there is reason to be cynical about it, and there is reason to be suspicious about the motives and sort of reading the tea leaves of why they would do this at this moment. But if they're just going to follow the law, it actually shouldn't be surprising that this is the decision that they reached. There was never a time in which you were required to show that the state intentionally discriminated. That was Alabama's argument, is that, okay, we used our computer module and we came up with just this one congressional district for black voters, but we didn't intend to do it, so no harm, no foul. That's never been the law. And so Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh today merely told them, we just follow the law. And the law says all you have to show is a discriminatory impact, the discriminatory effects, and it's as simple as that.
So motive didn't matter here.
No.
It had a discriminatory impact. So one assumes this does open the door to a whole bunch of other challenges, I assume?
100%.
Okay.
I think, as you mentioned, the litany of states, especially Louisiana, which has argued to have a second majority black district, which is the same argument that the voting rights advocates had marshaled here in the Alabama case, should apply in the case of Louisiana.
Should we read anything into that state legislature challenge with the North Carolina state legislature and state legislature supremacy, which has all sorts of potential impact? Should we read anything into this decision?
No. I think my money is they're going to duck that decision and say the whole thing is moot, because in that case, the decision that they're actually reviewing reversed itself because, of course, the political makeup of the court actually changed in North Carolina. And so because the political makeup on the court changed from Democratic to Republican, they reversed itself. And so I think the high court, the Supreme Court, is going to say, we're not going to touch that one. It's a whole ball of mess.
And there's not another case that could somehow bring that legislature
Oh, no, there
supremacy.
is. There is. There's a case in Ohio that's coming right behind it. And a lot of the justices have said, let's just decide this now. It's clearly an issue. Let's decide it before 2024.
All right, we shall see. Let me bring in Marina Jenkins here. And as I introduced you, Marina, you're on the side of the plaintiffs in this case, and you're working on a lot of other potential challenges. So first, let me get your reaction to this decision. You heard Laura's analysis. You heard my conspiratorial cynicism there. I'm not saying that's what I believe, but that's certainly in the ether. What do you think of this decision, and do you feel as if it's a solid opinion in your favor, not just an outcome in your favor?
Absolutely. Laura's absolutely right. This case should have been a very easy case for the court to decide. Should have been 9-0. Based on existing precedent. The law under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act has been solid, has not changed significantly with respect to redistricting for decades. And so this was another instance where we were wondering whether the court would stick to precedent or whether they would do something different because they wanted the law to be different than it is. And so, I understand the curiosity around the motivations behind sticking to the law as it exists. But when we brought this case in 2021 and an iteration of it in 2018, it was very clear that this is a straightforward win under existing law of Section 2. And the 3-judge panel with 2 Trump appointees agreed with us, and now the Supreme Court has agreed as well.
Now, Marina, though, you said you were still you were shook by this decision. So you seem, of course, they did it exactly the way we expected. It doesn't sound like you did expect this.
It's been an emotional day, I have to admit. I think the emotion comes from, the confluence of understanding where the law is and what it should be, and that we should get a straightforward result, but having real doubts about, the fealty of this court to the rule of law. And I think based on last summer's, outcome in Dobbs, it's a fair place emotionally to be, to really wonder, whether they're just, everything's game and it's all up in the air at this point.
So based on this opinion, where do you believe you have the ability to force some remaps in some of these, we know about Louisiana, Georgia's out there. Is Florida, is South Carolina, or any other southern states?
So the 3 states, in addition to Alabama, that have active Section 2 litigation are Louisiana, Georgia, and Texas. So those are states where there already are cases moving. I think Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia are almost certain to get results in favor of voters, but in time for the 2024 election. Texas is, Texas always is more complicated. There are a lot of different things happening there. Florida, there's no active Section 2 case. We have a state-based case under the Fair Districts Amendments in Florida. There is a racial gerrymandering case in federal court in Florida. So there are some other ruminations, some other things happening in Florida. So a Section 2 challenge that would be new would take a little more time to develop.
Right, and you're right. There's a whole potential on the whole whether that constitutional amendment of fair districts in Florida, whether it's constitutional in the state constitution. Let me bring in the political impact here. Dave Wasserman, you've already changed some ratings here. Look, you heard the places where this is most likely to impact. It sounds like you already think there's 3 to 5 Democratic seats here, possible just pickups just on a redrawn map.
Yeah, look, not all these seats are going to end up in solid Dem, but I think 2 of them are, one each in Alabama and Louisiana. For all the talk of this being an application of long-term legal precedent and the Jingles test from the 1980s, this is a political sea change, because keep in mind that Alabama and Louisiana have had only one majority black congressional district dating back to 1992. There have been some exceptions in the 90s in Louisiana, but in other states it's murkier because, for example, in South Carolina, it's really not possible to draw 2 black majority districts without some really ugly
but the state's population would demand it, would it not?
It would, but that doesn't itself lend itself to neat majority minority districts in
Right.
cases where the black population is really dispersed. It could be possible to draw an additional black majority district in metro Atlanta, but Republicans could convert an existing Democratic seat like Lucy McBath's into a majority black district without costing themselves a seat. And then in Texas, the challenge is really that there are a lot of places with melting pot suburban populations where one minority group can't necessarily make up a majority of a single district's population. So that could be harder to prove. And keep in mind, the Supreme Court did not embrace plurality or coalition districts here. They stuck with the precedent of if a group is politically cohesive, can make up more than 50% of a district's population, and there's sufficiently racially polarized voting, then it should be drawn.
So, Dave, just to close this out, I think, is there 5 states we're going to have new maps? Or 6? I mean, it's sort of absurd that it's like we're getting a massive redistricting do-over here before November of 2024. How many do you expect? We know New York's sitting out there. Could Ohio get redrawn too?
Look, definitely North Carolina, Alabama, virtually certain Louisiana. I think the other states, it's much more complicated. New York's process is not at all straightforward. Ohio's got a lot of gamesmanship in Columbus with a power sharing agreement in the state house. And it's possible the state Supreme Court there could just, let the map survive for another 2 years until 2026 when it expires. So, this is a game changer in the sense that it puts Democrats in closer contention for the majority in 2024. I think this
already
could
there
offset what we expect in North Carolina with Republicans re-gerrymandering the lines there. But there's a lot of legal process still to play out.
The amazing how much your job is, you got to follow courthouse cases these days, Wasserman, more so than ad spending. Let me bring it back to the courthouse here. Laura, in the opinion, the last times they've dealt with the Voting Rights Act, there's been a lot of lectures from the Supreme Court to Congress. You guys need to update this. You need to, this law is kind of out of date. You should be any of that in this opinion again?
No, because Congress had updated it, and they updated it in response to bad Supreme Court decisions in their view. And so this is the decision where they're essentially reaffirming what Congress already did. Certainly, Congress could take steps on its own anytime it wanted to try to shore up voting rights. It doesn't seem like they have the political will or the wind to do that. But no, the language in this opinion does not have sort of some of the sweeping rhetoric we've seen. And there are certainly other decisions from the Supreme Court on the table where you might see that.
And Marina, look, there's been a big movement among on the left of trying to, if you get enough political power in Congress, to rewrite the Voting Rights Act. Given this result, does that momentum stall?
I think so. I think, the fact that we are on pins and needles to understand whether the court is going to take away fundamental rights and protections for voting that have been in place for a long time, I think is reason enough for everyone, for all of us to keep moving forward on this fight to really lock in the protections. We need to bring back the protections under Section 5. There's a lot that we can do to make sure that we're not every couple years wondering what's going to be taken away next.
Yeah, I mean, it only just makes people like Dave Wasserman and I happy that we have to re-handicap races all the time. But that's probably not very good for the actual voters in this case to always wonder, now what district am I voting in every 2 years? Laura Jarrett, Marina Jenkins of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, and the Cook Political Report's David Wasserman. Thank you all for helping us sort this story out. Still ahead, if you're one of the millions of Americans experiencing this dangerous and disruptive wildfire smoke, we're going to tell you when you can expect to breathe fresher air. I don't want to say it's necessarily going to be fresh, but maybe fresher. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. If you're on the East Coast, this is all you're talking about. Smoke and haze continue to linger in the air across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions, with roughly 120 million Americans under severe air quality alerts. New York City skyline was unrecognizable yesterday, leaving many in D.C. and Philadelphia bracing for the worst. Well, today, it was the nation's capital that had to issue its first ever Code Purple, warning that air quality had reached unhealthy levels for everyone in the city. They got rid of baseball games. They got rid of a lot of stuff. Ripple effects across the capital region. Even the White House, which had to reschedule a major Pride Month event to Saturday when conditions are expected to improve. The haze continues to disrupt air travel as well, with the FAA issuing ground delays for Newark, LaGuardia, and Philadelphia airports, all due to low visibility. So far, at least 84 flights in the United States have been canceled due to this, and more than 3,000 others have been delayed. Speaking at the White House this afternoon, President Biden said he spoke with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and has directed U.S. agencies to promptly respond to Canadian requests for additional help with fighting these fires, including with people and other suppression assets. Joining me now to find out when we get some relief for the outdoors is our own meteorologist here at NBC News, Mr. Bill Cairns. Bill, man, when do we get to breathe again?
Saturday. I think a little bit on tomorrow, especially afternoon and evening, but really on Saturday, everyone will go back outside, get the blue skies, and go, okay, this is what we're more used to. Yeah. So let's get into the impact areas the hardest now. Almost all locations have hit their peak. So that's good. Doesn't mean the air is great, but it just means it's getting a little bit better. Everywhere in red is still what we'd call unhealthy, and that's for all groups, not just people with respiratory issues or elderly and the young. But areas in purple, only a few left that are very unhealthy. Earlier today, the worst of that was right over at D.C., so you've gone from purple to red. A little bit of an improvement, but you're at 180. At one point, it was in the low 300s. New York is at 157. Yesterday, at one point, it was nearing 400. So things have improved. But notice, Detroit, all of a sudden, your air is getting worse. The wind direction has shifted off the fires in Quebec, and now it's blowing more towards the Great Lakes in Michigan. So even Chicago's now in the unhealthy area. So it's not going to be like what happened in New York City, but you will notice sunrise and sunsets, that little glow, the reddish hues. That's from the smokes coming from Quebec, blowing all the way back into the Great Lakes. So here's how we are this evening at 6 p.m. As we go through the night, we're still tracking. Again, it's heading into the Great Lakes, and then it's swinging through the Mid-Atlantic. D.C. Friday morning, it's not going to be great once again, all the way to Philadelphia. But from New York City northwards, your air may be crystal clear, blue skies, or regular old clouds without any smoke in it. By the time we get to Friday evening, we're starting to see it breaking up a little bit, but still not the best around D.C. That's why I mentioned by the time we get to Saturday is when things begin to dramatically improve. And if we want to kind of end this entire threat, we need to get some of these fires out. 430 active fires, 235 of them are burning what we call out of control, uncontained. And notice all of them here in Quebec. That's why we've had so much smoke blowing down with that northerly wind. And so we need rain. They're in such remote areas, it's really difficult for firefighters, whether they're Canadian or our country or other countries, to put them out. Over the next 7 days, you see a little bit of yellow and oranges in here, maybe an inch and a half. That's not enough to put them out. So anytime that wind blows from the north, those fires will bring the smoke back.
So a month ago, we had this massive pollen outbreak in the Mid-Atlantic, and it was all due to the dry winter. How dry was the winter in Canada, and how much, obviously, that has to do with this? How unprecedented?
May was one of the warmest Mays they've ever had in Canada, and they didn't have a lot of rain either. So the snow melts. It's a hot May. Everything's dry and everything else,
faster.
and so it can burn quickly.
And now we're dealing with this, because I can't remember in my lifetime when Canada had this kind of wildfire problem.
This is one of the worst early seasons they've ever had. And the last time, by the way, that we saw the smoke blowing up from Canada like this, 2002. So many of us can't remember that at all.
It's literally a generation. Bill Cairns, thanks very much. Coming up, what the looming Trump indictment could mean for the race for the White House. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The last time former President Trump faced indictment, the other Republicans running for president largely and loudly came to his defense. Now the former president faces potential charges from special counsel Jack Smith's two-pronged investigation into both Trump's mishandling of classified documents and his actions in and around the January 6th insurrection. So what will it be this time? Well, let's consider Mike Pence. He launched his campaign yesterday with a forceful condemnation of Donald Trump's action on January 6th. And his PAC is now running an ad saying Trump failed the test of leadership. But then here's Pence a few moments ago urging the Justice Department against charging his former boss and current campaign rival.
I would hope the Department of Justice did not move forward, not because I know the facts, but simply because I think after years where we've seen a politicization of the Justice Department, it's undermined confidence of the American people in equal treatment of the law. The unprecedented action of a federal indictment of a former president of the United States, I think, would be extraordinarily divisive in our country, and I think it would send a terrible message to the wider world. I would hope that it would meet the very high threshold for the unprecedented action of a federal indictment against a former president of the United States.
Talk about a good way to kick off a conversation. Joining me now is on set, Jay Johnson, former Homeland Security Secretary under President Obama. He's also a former federal prosecutor as well. Noah Rothman is a senior writer for the National Review. Look, it's a good place to start, where Mike Pence is saying, I think the bar has to be essentially higher if you're going to indict even a former president. You think Merrick Garland actually agrees with everything he said there?
Well, that amounts to two different standards of justice.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I agree with that. I would say, however, that before you take on the high-profile indictment of a former president, we should be, have our ducks in order, make sure we've thought through all the evidentiary issues, all of the other issues that, would be thrown at them pre-trial. But in terms of standard or proof, there should not be separate levels of justice in this country for different people.
No, when it comes to Donald Trump, I've always said the Darth Vader test. And it's this. Remember, Darth Vader threw the Emperor over. I remember. That's right. Not Luke Skywalker, not Merrick Garland, not the justice. You see where I'm going here.
Okay.
Which is, if you're going to move on from Donald Trump, somebody inside Trump world, the voters, whatever it is, I've heard that argument. What do you make of what Pence is saying? Is it, and if that is the decision that's made, well, we would have charged anybody else, but he's a former president. We're going to let the court of public opinion decide this. Is that healthy or not healthy?
Well, there may just actually be real principle at stake here. I mean, we want to talk about this as though everybody's making political calculations. But it's quite possible that we have to assume that the indictment comes down, if it's the documents case, that it's going to focus on obstruction. Because if it was to focus on the documents, you'd be netting a whole lot of other very high-profile individuals. And Donald Trump is going to make a case of selective prosecution. And maybe his opponents subordinate their instincts to use this as fodder in their campaign. The gloves are already off. And say, well, yeah, he's got a point. There is selective prosecution going on here. Hillary Clinton had an email server.
Right.
30,000 emails under congressional subpoena, destroyed. Nobody prosecuted that.
Except there was no criminal intent there. None that I could see.
Well, that's not for us to decide. That's for a prosecutor to decide. And if the prosecution here is going to go after this, look, Merrick Garland appointed a special prosecutor in order to avoid a conflict of interest. What conflict of interest? He's not the president anymore. It's not his Justice Department. They clearly understand that there's political
He actually brings up a point. I do think, and I understand, I do think that Garland put himself in a box when he decided to go to special counsel.
A box of sorts, because if the special counsel comes to him and said, yes, there's a case that I intend to bring, you either have to go along with it or in a very high-profile way disagree with it. I want to take the flip side of what Noah said. How do we let pass what former President Trump did in Mar-a-Lago while prosecuting this kid in the Air National Guard in Massachusetts for violations of the Espionage Act? How do we let the former president have a pass on January 6th when you have oath keepers going to jail for 18 years? And so this, in my judgment, is a different era from when Ford pardoned Nixon. And I do think that the credibility of the rule of law and the credibility of our criminal justice system is on the line.
You think there'll be a race, Noah, among presidential candidates to say, I'll pardon former President Trump?
I don't think so, honestly. But that would be very clever. It would be a clever way to introduce...
I'm on DeSantis, right? Like, isn't that the way to say, well...
I mean, the guy is festooned with legal baggage, and that would be a way to get that into the public imagination. But it would also be too clever by half. I mean, the president, former president, would express his disapproval over that in ways that I think might enliven the Republican base. Look, the Republican base does like this guy. They do side with him. They do believe he's being persecuted.
This case has always seems to have impacted more people than the Manhattan case, right? We saw his numbers went down after the Mar-a-Lago news came out. They didn't go up.
Among Republicans?
No, and this is, yes, among everybody. It went down. Not immediately, the FBI thing, but then after a couple of weeks when people saw it, and then, of course, it wore out.
I tend to believe there's going to, in a rational world anyway, there should be a tipping point where after indictment number 2 or 3 or 4, the average voter, even the average Republican voter, says, you know what, this is too many cases.
Well, that's the question. Right. Which is there a straw here? And is he a camel?
I mean, after the Mar-a-Lago raid, there was this push to re-nominate Donald Trump by acclamation.
In the first week, I understand that. But remember, as more details came out, we did see a sort of suddenly his defenders disappeared.
Yeah,
public defender.
I think you could see that. It'll take some time for the sugar high to work its way out of the Republican bloodstream.
Yes.
But it's all a question of whether the real Republicans who really have taken the gloves off, Mike Pence, Chris Christie, and Ron DeSantis in particular, whether they say, look, this is good for me in my campaign, and even though I have misgivings about what the Justice Department is doing here, it benefits me politically to emphasize this.
What do you make of Mike Pence saying he thinks he's unfit for office, but he'd support him if he's the nominee?
I think he's a party man, and party men have vested interest in advancing the political party's agenda. Now, Donald Trump will not observe the same rules. He is not inclined, he's not going to be inclined to do that. And Chris Christie had a smart response to this where he said, look, I'll treat that pledge that I have to sign in order to get on the debate stage with as much support and forthrightness as Donald Trump would, which is to say none whatsoever. Good for him.
How do you feel as if Garland has managed all of these investigations so far? Because this was never easy. It's why he's there. The whole point that Biden wanted to put him there over the objections clearly of a whole bunch of people inside. Don't put a federal judge there because they don't know how to politics. They don't know how to do the modern media, right? There was all these complaints. But Biden in his own head thought, well, if you're going to deal with him, you want somebody with that credibility. How do you think he's held up?
Well, I start with this. I think Merrick Garland has done a lot to restore the credibility of the Department of Justice. When you look where it was under Trump and how politicized it had become, putting a former federal judge in the job, I think has done a lot to restore the credibility, notwithstanding all of the partisan attacks we see every day with the FBI. I wonder whether appointing Jack Smith was truly a good idea. Because he's still under Merrick Garland's supervision, and there are still plenty of very objective, apolitical federal prosecutors out there to do the job.
Feels like once you open that door, then the question is, well, why didn't you do a special counsel for Hunter Biden? Why didn't you do a special counsel for... I mean, it feels like once he opened that door, it starts to call into question a whole bunch of other...
I've never been a big fan of special counsels to begin with. When you have one mandate and one case, as opposed to hundreds or thousands to weigh, they can risk taking on a life of their own. No, I'm not saying that's true here, but there is that risk.
No, you're a historian of the conservative movement, too. Pat Robertson's influence with that. I mean, I feel like he's a founding father of the evangelical political movement, almost more so than Jerry Falwell, but I'm curious your thoughts.
Yes, I agree with you. And the evangelical political movement of the Pat Robertson era is no more.
Interesting.
It is a completely different animal. It has subordinated its moral foundations to the pursuit of political expedience. Now, I think a lot of its members would certainly object to that frame of reference, and that might... The
700 Club feels like it morphed into appealing to that new version of evangelical voter.
Pat Robertson had remained consistent, and people who are truly evangelicals in the religious sense, as opposed to the political sense, would agree with that and have a moral center and fortitude. There's a particular brand of evangelical Christian political philosophy.
Christian nationalism?
I wouldn't go that far, honestly. Okay. But I would say that it's political insofar as it's less moored to values and more moored towards or more engaged in political combat and advancing its political agenda, which is very distinct from having a religious philosophy.
Well, we're going to do a little bit more on Pat Robertson after the break, but Jay Johnson, Will Rothman, always good to have normal, cordial conversations between two very smart people. Thank you. Up next, power, politics, religion, and controversy. We have a little bit more on the legacy of the televangelist and former presidential candidate, Pat Robertson, and what it says about the future of conservatism in America. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Pat Robertson, the minister and television broadcaster who led the transformation of evangelicals into a political force in American politics, died today at the age of 93. He's the son of a former senator. Robertson's 1988 presidential run mobilized evangelicals to the conservative cause on a scale that had not been seen in modern politics, and it brought him to a shocking moderately strong second-place finish in the Iowa caucuses back then. Here's Robertson on Meet the Press just before he became an official presidential candidate.
Is that your intent, to convert every American to Christianity?
Certainly not in the political realm. Teddy Roosevelt had this rather interesting statement. He called the presidency a bully pulpit. And it's a place where you can draw together a moral consensus for noble goals. I think if there's one job a president can do, the more than others can't do, is to elevate the people and draw consensus. And I don't think that's the same thing as converting everybody to Christianity.
His presidential defeat only turned his Christian coalition into a more potent force, driving turnout for conservative candidates in that historic 1994 midterm election and it turning evangelicals into a key constituency of the GOP. Robertson also used his long-running television program to make many outlandish and sometimes hateful accusations, such as blaming Hurricane Katrina on God's anger over abortion and concurring with similar remarks made by Jerry Falwell on the September 11th attacks. Robertson also told viewers that God would intervene during Trump's attempts to overturn the 2020 election. Joining me now on set, NBC News national political correspondent Steve Kornacki. He's also author of the book Red and the Blue, the 90s and the Birth of Political Tribalism, which deals with this era of American politics. Steve, it's always a lot of fun to talk a little political history with you. My first introduction to Pat Robertson, I remember watching this ad with Roy Rogers in 1986. Let me play an excerpt of it.
Folks, we all know this nation's freedom was founded under God.
So join Dale and me as members of the National Committee to draft Pat Robertson for president. He's capable, he's qualified, and he cares. America needs Pat Robertson. So let's prove to Pat that we're ready to help.
Roy Rogers, back in the day, I mean, you know, Trigger was his horse. He was sort of a Western, I don't know how else you would describe him. I guess a Western pop culture icon.
Sure, yeah.
Back in the day, and he and his wife, Dale Evans, they were a variety show staple. You might see him on Hee Haw back in the day, or maybe back then, maybe the Mandrell sisters might have hosted them, right? That was all new to us back in the 80s. And then you wrote about how powerful, I mean, Robertson really turned it into a force.
Yeah, and you mentioned it. It was the moment, the high watermark for Pat Robertson politically was the Iowa caucuses in 1988.
He did nothing else after that in that campaign.
Yeah. He had some straw poll wins and everything, but what it did was it marked the arrival of evangelical Christians as a distinct force in Republican politics. He'd been coming for a while. Jerry Falwell had started the moral majority in the late 70s. Robertson obviously had been involved.
And arguably, Jimmy Carter won because
of
he
support
was the
from
first
evangelical Christians.
believer or born-again nominee of any party, and he mobilized evangelicals on his side.
And the disappointment of evangelicals like Jerry Falwell in Jimmy Carter as president is what led them to Ronald Reagan. And ironically, I point to that 88 second-place finish. To put that in context, second place, why was that so significant? Because third place was the sitting vice president, George H.W. Bush. And that Robertson defeat of Bush nearly derailed Bush in 1988.
If it wasn't for a snowstorm in New Hampshire, I don't think George H.W. Bush is the nominee. Bob Dole's the nominee in 88 without that snowstorm. You know who told me that? Bob Dole.
Yeah, I'm sure Bob Dole had a lot of time to think about that. But think about also the change in 1980, because the Iowa caucuses for both parties date back to about the 70s. 1980, they have the Iowa caucuses, evangelical Christians just starting to become a force. Bush wins the Iowa caucuses. Bush in 1980 is pro-choice. He is the last pro-choice Republican to win a major primary or caucus in the 40 years since then. And by 1988, Bush has changed politically. He sees the tide is changing. But by 88, Iowa, the same state that sided with pro-choice Bush in 80, gives Pat Robertson second place, televangelist Pat Robertson. That was the shift that took place in that time.
And now look at the Iowa caucuses. The last three open Republican races, and arguably you could say four, because I'll go ahead and put George W. Bush in there in 2000, the winner had to be essentially an evangelical or evangelical adjacent.
Yeah, 64% of the electorate in the 2016 Iowa caucuses, Republican caucuses, identified as evangelical or born-again Christian. Ted Cruz won them by 11 points. Cruz won the state by 3. He won the state because of the evangelical Christian vote.
And ironically, today, the Christian coalition has never been weaker as an organization.
And I think there's a big question, too, about, with Trump 2024, you see a guy like Pence come in. He thinks there's still a lane for an evangelical Christian to stand there on those grounds. It's an interesting test in Iowa.
Well, that electorate might split 3 or 4 ways, which we had not seen before. Always a pleasure to do history with you, Steve.
Happy
to
to
see you. Thank you all for being with us this hour. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.